Welcome to the Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. In this show, we analyze the greatest minds of narratology, both classic and current. Enjoy.
We're going to move on to Chapter 5, Living in Line. And this talks a lot about line work. This is kind of where... Actually, I guess not this chapter per se, but I think the next chapter is where it starts to become more about him trying to convince people to love comics and less about him
you guys
breaking down his perfect thesis on what comics are and how they work. But this is an interesting chapter. I don't have as much to say about it, I don't think, as the other ones, but he's talking about like images and line work evoking the senses or the emotions of the reader, and certain things, certain ways of drawing things, certain types of lines evoke different feelings when you're looking at them, when you're reading them. So everything kind of expresses, everything that you're seeing on this page is expressing an intention, an artist's intention, and the mood that he wants or she wants to set for you. So, you know, he does a little bit about like lines as visual metaphors and iconography of more metaphorical lines, like stink lines and like hearts above your head or whatever. But looks like you guys had a little bit to say about what I already talked about. Go ahead.
I actually, this is where I have a little bit of background in linguistics and things like body language and how different cultures. So there's a very famous example of Aboriginal natives don't basically eye contact is considered very rude to them. Thus, the judicial system in Australia tends to be very negative towards them, of assuming guilt because they won't look people in the eye. And I was wondering, to the point of, granted, yes, things like pain are universal, sadness is universal, but representation, how much of that is culturally dependent, and how much of that is actually universal, and how much are we making an assumption that our universal iconography and experience with these different emotions will be captured elsewhere. And I don't have an answer to that because it's been a while since I've actually dealt in the subject, but I just was thinking that this is where you got to be careful of making an assumption that the Wittgensteinian beetle, your beetle in the blue box, or the blue beetle in the box, is the same as another person's. And and especially when it comes to emotions and abstract concepts, it's easy to make what is a subjective experience universal. So I was just kind of, if anything, well, I would like to explore that aspect most of where I would perhaps challenge him on.
Sure, I'm going to build on that because I think like it's there's a lot to delve into there, and I'll try to tie it back because it sort of goes back to chapter 2, I believe, that whatever chapter he introduced the iconography in, right? It's like, and so what you said, Steve, like, all right, you see a comic, a guy stands next to a trash can, and like wavy lines are like that's supposed to convey like an unpleasant smell.
Mm-hmm.
That iconography has been used so much, but maybe it is now more universal than it would have been maybe like culturally divided in a sense. And there are very various myriad examples that you can point to that maybe if audience A versus audience B was reading a comic produced by culture A and read by culture B, right? Like something might be lost literally in translation because of something like things like that, right? So I thought you're right. Like that's a very fascinating idea, possibly one of the most like again interestingly philosophical conundrums in a sense that how to convey, right? And the second thing, Steve, I want to tie in is that like technically, especially comics, they're just, when you really get down to it, it's just a bunch of lines, right? Like creating an image, but those lines can have so much power depending on either a universality of things or a very, very culturally specific definition of things. And I think that is very fascinating. And I thought that was like one of the most well pointed out ideas and explorations of it. So
yeah. I will point out he does talk about this in terms of, he goes back to the manga examples, and he says, like, they in Japan they have a whole different set of like what are their cultural iconic touchstones, like, you got the lust with the blood shooting out of the kid's nose, like the teenager's nose or whatever, and like, different things happening with anger and stuff like that. So it is really, I think it's a lot of it is up to the artist, to put up forward my own thing. It's up to the artist to make clear
conveyable
what you're trying to convey with any specific thing, and knowing your audience if you're going to do something very symbolic or iconic in this case, or B, making it clear what those icons and symbols represent. Sorry, Chris, I think you were about to say something a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I was going to address the synesthesia in the room. Because that's the one, because he did mention that. I was kind of hoping that he'd bring it up, because I know I don't know what degree it is, but I think everybody more or less has some bit of synesthesia. I do a lot. I have since a child. I have assigned colors to numbers and to letters. And it's funny because a friend of mine has the same degree I do, and my favorite color is orange. His favorite color is blue. And we did a comparison of how we, to Ian's point, what was his, what were our agreed upon colors for what letters?
If you're orange, etc.
Yeah, exactly. So I always found this really interesting, especially when you're later on when he talks about, coloring in panels, that sometimes something will hit me, and even a black and white will start showing up in color. And also working in music, like I close my eyes and I hear, hearing things. I've assigned colors to certain things, certain pads, certain instruments. But again, I always think it's really funny because there is no agreed upon thing. Like, I'm really big, probably one of the reasons I'm really big into light shows, and I even know like the different, like the different kinds of lights there are. And I figured an anachronism from Glow was they didn't have that kind of very light back then, but it's kind of one of those things, which to me, it's just like, sometimes, what I would consider a good light show for, whatever we're doing versus what somebody else had in mind. It all comes back down to the synesthesia in the room, as I was saying, because one person's going to interpret this one way, based on emotion, and you can expand color to not just the literal color, orange, blue, but just the different ways things are, textured and so forth. So yeah, that's all. I got really excited with that because I'm like, wow, this conversation keeps coming up. And I was just like, I'm glad he brought it up.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I think that's going to kind of do it for chapter 5, talking about lines. He does mention also that he sees kind of words as the clearest iconic identifiers of the emotions and senses because they are descriptive. Like, you're in words describing what.
Levo, I hate it when a comic tells me what to feel. That makes me so angry.
Yeah.
Facial expressions are, though, the clearest indicator of
emotionality.
Well, if you're trying to tell a story, I guess his thing is he's saying, yeah, you can make a facial expression that could be interpreted differently in Japan or America, but if you say he was angry.
I'm pretty sure everyone makes the same facial expression when they're punched in the face. So
it's pretty universal, I guess we'll say.
Yeah, fair enough. But yeah, he does kind of talk about that as like words, like taking over line work from, at some point it crosses over from like these simple drawing to words in terms of the way that they work together, I guess. So let's talk about chapter 6. It's called Show and Tell. It kind of talks about words and pictures how they work together.
That's a visual treat for those of you watching.
And sorry, Ian's flipping us off, flipping the camera off.
I didn't need to tell. I just I can express
It's up to your
everything.
interpretation of who or what he's flipping
Shona
off.
didn't tell. We got to put a word balloon up over that in the video. But this is kind of the chapter that talks about how words and pictures work together, especially in comics. We've spent a bunch of chapters talking about how they work separately, like each in their own way. Probably more so pictures so up to this point, but now he brings back into the idea of like, all right, but a comic is the two of these things working together, show and tell. As he says, you don't always have to have words in a comic to make it work, but a lot of them do. And if you do, then they become a very important part of how that story works.
Functional.
Actually, I think he gives a couple of different ways that it can work with each other. List. I don't know if you're going to go over that, but I thought the most interesting one was where you have the use of visuals and language, where neither of them in isolation would give the complete scene. That it requires both of them in order to convey the picture. I thought that was actually a really good argument for the uniqueness of comics.
Yeah, and I will in a bit briefly go over all 7 of those, but Scott, go ahead before we get to that.
Yeah, just that like the melding, like right, like so it's maybe like a plug test tease for something we'll do later. But there's a comic I suggested for us to do in the wake of doing Understanding Comics, in which if you separate the words, the language from the actual artwork, neither of them are going to work. But when melded together in such a way, then it creates something greater than each, of course, like the sum of the parts, etc. Yeah, that's all. I just want to follow up on that, and now you can go on with the rest.
This is what I was going to say. This is going to be anybody who's listening to us, go watch the video, because he starts us off with a kid doing show and tell, trying to guess it's a robot, an airplane, whatever. This is me. I'm forever like losing. I'm forever like losing the words as I'm going along, and I always, as demonstrated so far in this, having visual aids helps me. So, when I saw this, I was just like, "Wow, I'm that kid still."
Yeah, so like it is a just like kind of a comical opening to the chapter, but he goes on and talks about this, and I like his take on kind of the art writing combinations that they're he goes back to that picture plane. He says they're more easily combined when they're closer to each other on that plane, when they're more direct, less abstract, and the more abstract you make either or both, the more work you have to do to connect them in the reader's brain, which is kind of a really interesting take on it. And I think it bears out. But let's talk about this list that he gives of categories of word picture combinations in panels. And he says this isn't the whole list. There's infinite, amounts of ways that you can combine things. But what he says is he's got this list of 7 here in the book. And the first one is word specific. So words tell a story and pictures are just kind of there. The second one is picture specific, and pictures are telling the story, and words are not really adding much to the story. They're a flavor, basically. The third one is duo specific. Words and pictures are like combined, and they're saying the exact same thing, basically. So you can
a sunny
see
day and a picture of a sun.
Yeah, you can see what is explained in the words. The fourth one is additive, where words amplify or elaborate on what's going on in the picture. The fifth one is parallel, where words and pictures follow different lines. So this is one of my favorite ones in you see it in movies too, but in comics a lot, where something's happening in the images and something is being said, usually, or a lot of times in like captions or something like that, and they have nothing to do with each other. They're seemingly like non sequiturs, but a lot of times comics will use this and then tie the two together at a point later on down the line.
Panel.
Yeah, which I personally, I love that mode of
style.
storytelling. Yeah. The sixth one is montage, where words are treated as part of the picture, and just like embedded within the frame or the panel. And then the seventh one is interdependent, and this is the one you were talking about, Ian, where words and pictures each tell an integral part of the story and can't work alone. So
my favorite one.
yeah, exactly. And the artist and writer have to decide kind of what the correct balance of words and images are as they go. Every panel, they're trying to strike the right balance in terms of that. So, yeah, I love those. I love that breakdown, and of course there are more, as he says, but these are kind of ones that you see a lot in storytelling, especially in comics. So, yeah, do you guys have anything else to say about that list, or?
Not much. Like his breakdown is good, and your breakdown of his breakdown was fine. Like, and we just said like what ones we prefer, that are going to that we like the most.
Yeah.
When presented with, and yeah, I mean you're right. Like, sure, those like it's almost like the 7 basic stories, right? Like then there's infinite combinations of them. But like I feel like it's going back to what we first started out with. Like he's like, hey, here's how kind of it works. Like here's like the basics of it, and then everyone can go nuts with it, and everyone has their own preference and what works for them and what might not work for others, etc. But yeah, just laying out the idea of it, and it's a one laid bare. It's interesting to see like sort of the mechanics behind the scenes, if you will. Is all.
Yeah. Absolutely. All right. Well, we'll leave off chapter 6 there and go into chapter 7. It's called The 6 Steps. I feel like he should have made this chapter 6, right? But
come on now, yeah.
Title.
Missed opportunity, buddy.
But this is basically McCloud's personal definition of art as kind of being anything not related. No, he starts off with his definition of art as being anything not related to survival or reproduction.
Fucking and eating is the things that humans need to do to keep
Pretty
going.
much. And running away from monsters and lions and shit. But
survival and sex, I guess. I think he said.
I've made an art of avoiding monsters, so
there you go. Which I mean, I'm not against this definition, but this is definitely the chapter where he's like, foot down. Comics are art. We shouldn't even have to talk about this, but since we clearly do, like obviously. This is art, and he talks about the path of the artist, and this works for any artist in any medium, and I think it's the main point of this chapter, and I think it's the most important part of this chapter. So he talks about the path of the artist being from, so the first step is idea or purpose, the second step is form, the third step is idiom, the fourth step is structure, fifth is craft, and sixth is surface, and he talks about like artists who start like great pieces of art contain all 6 of these, right? But the easiest one to fake, I guess, is the surface. Yeah. And then
the one that people like audiences most, of course, like
the
most obvious aspect of it.
Right. So he says like, a lot of times artists will start and like try to do something surface, and then when they realize like the history of what's come before them, they'll move on, try to study the craft and get better at that, working backwards through this list, move on to like story structure, and move on from there to like finding how they want to use idiom, the idiom of everything in this, and then form, and then eventually idea and purpose, if they ever get that far. And I think it's interesting to like see the way that he goes through it. The story's base is number 1, but where he thinks artists start is number 6, and try to have to build up their arsenal of these other steps as they go. So yeah, I mean that's a lot of what I was going to say about this chapter. It looks like Ian, you want to say something?
Well, I want to tie this actually into the death of the artist or the death of the author, whatever that is.
Author, I believe.
But I want to call this death of the artist. And specifically about critical analysis of objects is that our job is to find, or at least what we've tasked ourselves to find, the idea at the center of this kind of thing. But Scott McCloud makes an argument that art can challenge things like form and idiom and work on that. But if you're, and that's a valid form of art, is to try to push, in a sense, stylistic elements to an extreme. At the absence of the idea and I think he has a thing about the hollow apple or something like that.
Mhm.
But I think that's necessarily maybe a criticism of our job as a critic, is that if our goal is to analyze one, and the intent of the artist is not to have a one but to have a two and a three, and that makes them a valid argument in Scott McCloud's opinion, then our job is that's a limit of our experience as critics. But I also think that everything should have an idea behind it.
Jesus, I didn't think of that, Christ. But I mean, it's it's an interesting point. Like, yes, like they might be at odds with each other at certain points based on the intention of one or the other. Perhaps that can be its own really episode or something. Like, definitely could delve into that. But I do like it. I didn't even think about it. But what the only note I had on this chapter, Steve, was like boredom equals the birth of art and humanity.
Yeah.
Like, I think he has no examples. Like, yeah, cavemen like drawing like little with a stick in the sand. Like, that's art. Like, because they were bored, they didn't have to run from creatures trying to hunt them, and they're not having sex, so they're bored and they're making art.
Yep. I do want to say that is the reason. So that's the reason that he says number one, the top of this list is idea / purpose, because you don't necessarily have to have an idea to make art, he says, but there is some kind of purpose to what you're doing in terms of what the art is going to be. If there is some kind of purpose, then that's a higher level of art. So it doesn't have to be like a big idea, but it has to have like a purpose to, like, in terms of art.
Yeah, but I would say that he does make the argument for like the validity of being at level 3 and attempting to expand the definitions of what level 3 or 2 or form or however you want to describe it can be. And yeah, that in a sense is the purpose. But I mean, we're arguing semantics here. But I just thought that was interesting.
I like
No, I mean, it's point well taken. Chris?
Oh no! During this conversation, I'm reading this too. I kept thinking about something Roger Ebert said about like video games not being art.
I was going to bring that up, but
I'm sitting here thinking, how can we get, like, he's not around for us to, like, but that was the first
We've
thing.
never been as shy at attacking dead people on this.
Yeah,
I-
slap Ebert in his dead face with this book.
still fucking wrong, and fuck him and for that.
Because especially being a film critic, you look at something like video games, and most of the components that go into film go into the video game. And I say that because I'm not sure if it's this chapter or not, but he also does say that with regard to, like, comics versus like films or plays, or even in '92 the video games were there, but they weren't quite what they are.
Both younger
became later in the decade even.
Sure.
Yeah, but no,
So
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Let's move on to chapter 8, A Word About Color, or I believe it was originally called "Oh shit, I forgot about color."
no. I'll just say the title of the chapter says it all. Here's a word about color.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's go to chapter 9 now. Like,
He does like go through this like interesting history of color. I think that McCloud at this point in his career, he had only done Zot, which is this gigantic tome of a book, but that was all black and white. I don't think he's ever really done a color comic, so it's not his main area of interest, which is why I think this is kind of buried at the end of this book.
color
but,
also exists in the art form.
He does have an interesting like discussion of the history of how color came into comics and stuff like that, but it's really not that much there.
My favorite line in this work is here, where he goes, people often say that superheroes are modern mythology, and that might be because of color.
Yeah.
And then has nothing else to say about it.
Yeah. He's got this, he does have this like really, actually that was the one thing that I wanted to bring up. He does have this really interesting panel where he's talking about he says, while comics colors were less than expressionistic, they were, because they had a very small palette to work with. They were fixed with a new iconic power because costume colors remained exactly the same panel after panel. They came to symbolize characters in the reader's minds. And then many see the superhero as a form of modern mythology. If so, this aspect of color may play a part. Symbols are the stuff of which gods are made. So yeah, that's exactly what you're talking about. And seeing that in here, I think that they're probably has been more written on this topic since this book came out. And I think that there's other places to find it. I wish that there was more in here.
I also think that Joseph Campbell actually makes better arguments for why superheroes are modern-day mythology, taking it from a completely different perspective, not a symbolic one, but from a storytelling perspective. So I might disagree with. There might be. This is the part I kind of disagreed with him most, but also he didn't flesh it out as much as he could have. So.
Yeah.
So there was the word about color. Anyway, Steve-O, what's the next chapter?
So that's the word about color. Unless anybody else has anything else to say about that,
I'm gonna come back to something I said about light shows. It's one thing I learned in stagecraft is that the blending of colors and light versus, like when you're doing lights, I can't remember. I think if you take a blue spot and a yellow spot, you'll get a
primary color.
It'll be like pink. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
No, that's all. I was like reading up on
that. To be fair, Chris, he does. He's like, here's how
Yeah.
main primary colors for painting and printing. They're like slightly different. I think they're not. It's not blue, yellow, red. It's the other ones. Yeah.
And he was talking about that with the TV. It's no, but I just thought it was because it was one of those things where I'm like, speaking of color, beams of light in like I said in light shows and so forth.
Indeed. So, and then we're up to the last chapter, chapter 9, putting it all together, exactly what it says in the tin. It's just a synopsis of the rest of the book and a call to like further comic scholarship, right? In a word. So, I mean, taking a look at this book as a whole, I really loved it the first time I read it, and I really enjoyed reading it the second time back through again. I'll probably, I think I'm going to start reading this like regularly, like once or every year or two, just because I think it has a lot to say about the reasons that I love reading comics, and it's a good reminder every time I go through. It's like a 2-hour thing to read, so it's not like crazy long, but it's a good reminder of like the things that I should be paying attention to when I'm reading a comic, stuff like that.
And it's also a confirmation that you're not wasting your time on a trivial matter.
Well, being a reader, that's up in the air. Maybe if I was an artist.
Sure. But no, I mean, you're right. Like, it's, as you said, like, and not that I disagree, like, I in fact agree quite a bit, but it's a lot of it, it's like, as if McCloud is like trying to convince anyone who isn't already convinced that this is a serious, legitimate artwork, an art form, and here's why and how it can work, and versus other art forms, mediums that have, existed longer than it.
And oddly enough, doing it in the very medium they're dismissing.
And
so that they're going to take his work less seriously.
I mean, it's a double-edged sword there, but I mean, of course, that's
well. It does come back to the show and tell part. That's the show and tell aspect of it.
For sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a book that made a lot of people take comics more seriously. This, along with Mouse, coming out around the same time, because it's hard to write something like this off as like kids stuff, like if you're one of those commentators that are like, oh, all comics are for kids or whatever. It's hard to write this off as easily. It's obviously a work of like, academia to an extent. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I don't think I'm going to go much further. We've talked about this for like, I don't know, an hour and 15 minutes at this point. So do you guys have anything else you want to mention?
We just told you all that.
What was that? What'd you say, Scott?
I said, just go read the book, or don't, because we just told you everything about it. So.
Yeah,
but as I said before, I think it works really good as a reference book, and I think I agree with Steve-O, and that is something to return to because it does go beyond comics. I think, this guy's preaching the choir, like as far as selling comics as art to me, but the things he brought up were universal a lot.
And so the ideas of everything.
Yeah, indeed. All right. Well, thanks for joining us today, guys. This has been another episode of The Lost Signals, talks philosophy and narratology. And I've been your host, Steve Hermosi, joined tonight on the show by Christopher Morgan.
Have a good night.
Scott Thurlow.
And M in Infinite Canvas.
And Jonathan Ian Manzer.
There's a segment of this they talk about Eastern style of non-content sometimes being as powerful a statement as actually having something to say.
And with that,
Goodbye.
for joining us.
Thank you for listening to The Lost Signals discusses philosophy, narrative, and the mechanics of criticism. Editing and engineering by Jonathan Ian Manzer. Music by Christopher Morgan. Check us out on YouTube and iTunes for the shows, and on Facebook and Twitter for updates.